moment. There's a QR code and like just a website here on the left with the access code that if you sign into, there's a few questions on there just asking about you guys, so I can kind of tailor the presentation a bit better. So I'll go over there slowly now, so there's still time to do it if you haven't already done it. Oh, wrong way. And it's live, so as you do it, I'll also see it uptake. So okay, so not many people have done it so far, but it's nice to see that there is a bit of a diversity there. So we've got people from agriculture, engineering, biologists, and also project managers. So as well as a lot of people are just varied backgrounds. So yes, well done. More. And a fisheries marine ecology. We've got a marine modeler in there. I'll go through the next question very slow. You know what? Maybe we just hang on because I really want to see what everyone's backgrounds are. So we've got scuba diver. Maybe people need me to go back to the main page. But anyway, this is fine. So I'm going to go to the next one. For those who are participating right now, you have some time. So next question is age bracket. Interesting, very interesting. I was really curious about this one because fisheries tend to be more biased maybe towards older generations, but it's really nice. And in climate change, potentially younger generations. So I know we've got a very small sample size right now, but most people seem to be in the 21 to 35-year-old age bracket. Mostly male. Okay, cool. Again, this is something I was interested in because fisheries tend to be biased by males or men. So it's nice to see some women in there. So well done, girls. So yes. And then what comes to mind when you hear climate change? And I was curious about this one just purely because it can be quite a scary topic or a bit intimidating. And sell my skis. Oh no, don't do it. So we've got lack of snow, polar bears. That's a good one for WWF, just advertising and making climate change more not appealing to the public, but more well known to the public. So the impacts of polar bears and like their lack of being able to find icebergs is a big one. Sea, famine, weather extreme, adaptation, storms, oil and gas, poverty. Yeah, it's definitely, and it's here as well, which is another just quite a scary thing that we're seeing day to day. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one. Biggest threat to salmon. Oh, this was good. I was like, please no one put none. So well done, everyone. All of the above, everything is, whatever you put is correct. So everything is a big threat to salmon at the moment, but it's not just one or the other. It's like the combined impact of it all that's having an impact to this species. Okay, going to go on to the next one. I'm kind of giving you like a little heads up just before we go across. But yes, okay, 3 words you think of when you hear genetics. Okay, children, parents, evolution, DNA, diversity, surveys, family, population. So I'm sure a lot of you have done evolution, divergence. I'm sure a lot of you have done the 23andMe, where you submit your DNA, or like you do a swab, you get your DNA sequence and you can see how closely related you are to other people in other countries. So what country you might have hailed from. So yeah, really interesting. And I'll go a bit more into that I think that was it. Yeah, into the presentation. So I just go back to here. So thank you everyone who took part. There is another Mentimeter question as we go through. So just heads up, just one more, at least one more live one. So yeah. So you all seem pretty clued up on climate change, so I probably don't need to show you that almost every single day in the news, we're seeing some kind of climate disaster come up, like flooding, wildfires, big severe storms, and the frequency of storms are increasing as well. And every time you open the news story, there's something new that comes up all over the world. And these are all human-induced climate change events. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen Johan Rockström's TED Talk on climate change. If you haven't, definitely recommend going to see it. He's a really inspiring speaker on climate change and leaves you feeling hopeful at the end as well. It's not just doom and gloom. So if you haven't, definitely go and recommend seeing his TED Talk online. So this slide is actually from his presentation, and it's just showing you how temperature has changed over time. And you can see here about 10,000 years ago, how human civilization really begun. And this is thanks to this very nice stable 14 degrees temperature we experienced during this time. And this is due to the Earth's buffering capacity. So we've got the Amazon rainforest, we've got the glaciers, they're all carbon sinks, sucking carbon from the atmosphere and taking away all the impacts like from the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, that all the carbon that we're emitting, it's sucking up. So the Earth has had this amazing buffering capacity, but we're reaching the end of that capacity. And I think recently the Amazon rainforest switched from being a carbon source, switched from being a carbon sink to being a carbon source. So it's emitting more carbon than it is sucking it up. So we're reaching the end of Earth's capacity to be able to buffer what we give out as humans. So right now we're at a 1.2 degrees Celsius increase from that period, and we haven't experienced that temperature increase since about 100,000 years ago. And if we carry on in this trajectory, in about 100 years' time, we're going to be reaching about 2.7 degrees Celsius, and that's warmer than we've never pushed a 2 degrees Celsius mark since millions of years ago. So it's a really worrying time if we carry on this trajectory that we're seeing here. So if we look at the oceans absorb more than like 90% of heat emitted. And so consequently, the temperatures are increasing the oceans are increasing temperatures as the years have gone on. So in 2023, we see this huge spike in ocean sea surface temperature in 2023, and the patterns of 2024 also look quite similar. So it's really worrying that we're seeing the oceans having these huge increase in sea surface temperature. And if we look in the Northeast Atlantic Ocean, you can see all the sea surface temperatures in the dark red. That's where temperatures are really high, and that's where the Atlantic salmon migrate through as well. So this is a distribution of Atlantic salmon in the top right plot. Bottom right plot is how they migrate through the Atlantic Ocean. So lots go and feed off the coast of Greenland, some on the coast of the Faroes, but they all most of them have to migrate across this area of high heat. So this map in particular was from June 2023. So it does change, but it's worrying how much it has changed. So that leads us to ask what the status is of the Atlantic salmon. And before 2023, they were by the IUCN classification least concern. But in Great Britain, that moved from least concern to endangered as of 2023. And globally, it moved from least concern to near threatened. So we're seeing really big declines in Atlantic salmon across their range. And we can see that in these plots by the ICES working group. So in 2023, they released these plots just showing how the reported catches in tons. Just make note of the y-axis here, which changes. So Canada's 150, Denmark is 10. So there's big changes on the y-axis, but the general pattern tends to be a decline. So Ireland declining, Iceland, Sweden, England and Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, there's a huge decrease in numbers of reported catch. So the grey is the coastal catch, the white is the estuarine catch, and then in-river catch is in dark grey at the bottom. So downward trends for pretty much every country that we're seeing in the Atlantic salmon distribution. So the life cycle of Atlantic salmon is really complicated. I know there's a few biologists in the audience, so it's really good to see, but there's also some engineers who might not know as much about the Atlantic salmon life cycle. So just walk us through. So you've got your breeding pair that come in from the ocean. The female makes a little nest. So she gets rid of all the gravel and then releases her eggs. The male fertilizes the eggs. They land in the nest, and then the female covers them up with gravel so that lots of water can still flush over them. They're still very well oxygenated, and they stay under that gravel for some time. When they hatch, and then they develop into alevins, these guys at the bottom, and they have their yolk sac underneath their chin, and they just stay under the gravel. They don't need to go anywhere because all the nutrition is coming from their yolk sac. And as that yolk sac is slowly depleted, then they're like, okay, I need to actually swim up out of the gravel and start feeding outside. So that's when they're called fry. Once they spent some time as a fry, they develop into parr, and that's when you see those characteristic thumbprints, which helps them camouflage them against the bottom of the rivers. Um, so they stay up as parr. It depends on where they're from. If they're from like the UK, it's normally about 2 years for 2 years in the UK. And then if you're further north, like Finland, it can be 4 to 5 years they can remain at this particular life stage. And some decide, actually, it's quite nice in here. I don't need to migrate to the sea and risk my life. I can just hang out and spawn and make just as many offspring as I would if I migrated. And that's particularly the case with males. So you can see here, I don't know if anyone really noticed it at the start, but if you can see my mouse, which hopefully you can, is like a parr being fertilizing the female's eggs here. And it tends to be the male who stay as resident parr, because females, if they go out to sea, they get bigger, they can carry more eggs, and they have more offspring. So it's more of an advantage for females to migrate out to sea. So you tend to get more male resident parr than females. So you're a parr, you want to go out to sea, so then you have to undergo this very challenging physiological transformation where you need to be able to cope with that salinity difference from freshwater to the marine environment. So to do that, you need to go through a process known as smoltification. So you could become very silvery in color like these guys here. So that's to stop them from being exposed to as many predators out at sea. So you can imagine you're in this big body of water and the sun's reflecting off your shiny skin, and that's going to confuse the predators who will just see you as reflections from the sun on top of the water. They also get very streamlined in shape, so it makes them easier to swim through big ocean waters. And yeah, generally just much better well suited than the parr are for ocean migration, as well as dealing with that salinity change. So then they transition from being freshwater living to ocean living, and then they have to migrate often thousands of kilometers out to sea to their feeding grounds, like I said previously, often off the coast of Greenland, to feed and get large. And then they can spend one sea winter, so just one winter at sea, before coming back to the rivers where they grew up, where they spawned, the exact same ones. That they're known, if they do the one sea winter trip, it's the grills. If they decide to stay at sea for multiple sea winter, they're known as multi-sea winter fish. They tend to be a lot bigger. So they come back and then they start that life cycle over again. And Atlantic salmon are really cool because, unlike Pacific salmon who just spawn once and die, they can often go back out to sea and spawn for consecutive years. So, but climate change are affecting all the stages of this Atlantic salmon life history cycle. So during this eggs and alevin stage, development can often be impacted by temperature. So if temperatures are high, then it can cause development to go faster, which means they may hatch and develop into a fry a lot earlier when the prey is not available. So maybe the temperatures elsewhere where they need to swim as fry is not suitable. So that can cause a lot of mortalities. So it can reduce prey availability, which can be across the whole life cycle, and also invasive species. So as the climate is warming, more species from the south are coming up to the north and taking over habitats and prey that was otherwise available for our native species that we have here. And on top of that was all the pressures that you guys showed earlier as well. So we've got habitat destruction, overfishing, migration barriers, pollution, diseases, and genetic integration as well. And I just want to focus a bit on the genetic integration part. And that's just so you have the farm salmon and then you have the wild salmon, and when they breed and they mix their genetics together, that's what genetic integration is. So Mentimeter, I hope people are ready for this one. So again, I'll just leave it on this screen a bit longer this time, so you can see that this is a QR code, access code if people don't have it. And if you could just select whether you think A is wild or whether you think B is the wild fish, that'll just be really, I'm just curious to see what people put. It is AI generated, so these aren't actually real fish. But it'd be interesting to see what everyone puts. So I'm going to slowly make my way over. So if you haven't already, please take note of QR code and the access code for the Mentimeter. Okay, I'm going to switch. Yay, nice. Okay, so not sure. A, B. Oh, we're switching. Hold on, I need to remind myself what it was. Which one is wild? Okay. Nice. Okay, cool. Let's go back. Okay, people still voting. Nice. So 7 people vote B, 5 people A. Let's have a look at what it was, because again, so B was the wild fish. Let me go back up, play from current slide. So most of you got it, and it is AI generated. But imagine, like in the real life, it can be quite hard to tell. But often the farm fish in real life have a lot of like their skin's not very nice. Often they're clipped on their skins as well. They're fit, and actually this kind of amplified it here. So the fins aren't as like wild as this wild fin. You can see the shape of it is a lot different. The shape of the fish, it's more like just a bit frumpy, looks a bit more like a couch potato, whereas this guy here is like the sexy fish. It's got very, it's been working out. It's got a nice color, nice shape, fins are good, and you can see it looks quite aggressive. So we'll just dive into that a bit more. So farm fish are bred for traits like fast growth and disease resistance, and only a select few individuals are bred. So you want them to be, as a farmer, you want to breed for the biggest, juiciest fish. So you only select those biggest ones so that their offspring will also be big and so on. But that kind of breeding results in low genetic diversity. So what is that? So if you imagine a toolbox and all you have in there is spanners, although again, this is AI generated and I don't even know what this one is, but it just means that if you only have spanners, then you're very poorly equipped to cope with any kind of change if something goes wrong. Whereas if you have high genetic diversity, like the wild populations, you've got a lot more tools in your toolbox to be able to cope with change. So you really want to be able to cope with change, you really need higher genetic diversity. And this higher genetic diversity in the wild populations are thanks to their very diverse environments that they're exposed to. So they have to become locally adapted to all these things, which are then, which is enabled by a higher genetic diversity because of that long-term adaptation. So wild populations, there's very diverse environments. Atlantic salmon, you saw the distribution, it's all over the place. They have that natal homing, so they go back to their rivers where they were born. So then that particular river system is the river that they're adapted to. Then that also means they have different migration timings for the different rivers. So more northerly populations migrate later because it's cooler than those southerly populations. They're also adapted to predator avoidance for their different river systems. Some rivers might have different predators to others. Endurance swimming, I think I mentioned, they migrate thousands of kilometers. The water flow is different between different rivers. They have to cope with the salinity transition, finding food, the reproductive timing, and also disease resistance. Excuse me. Some rivers might have a different disease susceptibility than others. So in contrast, farm salmon, locally adapted to reduce competition, hand feeding, no predators, low swim endurance, reduced aggression, the same size, delayed sexual maturation. So you can imagine, you look at the aquaculture pens that you can often see in the sea locks or the fjords, and they're all swimming around in circles, and there's someone there feeding food, as much food as they need. So they don't have to fight, and they don't need to have that swim endurance that a wild Atlantic salmon does to migrate all that way. So you can imagine if those two interbreed, if they mate and their offspring, they're not going to be locally adapted to their home environment. They're going to have some of these traits in there as well. So this genetic diversity that was like built up over millions of years and thousands of years, if you count recent divergences as well with the glacial retreats, that genetic diversity is going to slowly become more like this genetic diversity. It's going to get rid of what's important for the wild and replace it for what's important for aquaculture, which is not what the wild populations need. So I mentioned that wild populations are locally adapted to their rivers and they migrate thousands of kilometers, but how do they know when to leave their rivers? And again, that's local adaptation. So they adapted to that river's particular daylight and that river's particular temperature cues to know when they should migrate to their destination, which is thousands of kilometers away, and what time their prey is available at that destination. And when they over thousands of years, that has evolved to be predictable. So they know that at X degrees Celsius and at this kind of daylight, I need to start moving. But with climate change, those cues are being disrupted. So temperatures are warming a lot faster. So that might trigger that migratory need for that population or individual. So when they arrive at their destination, it could be out with the optimal migration timing window. So maybe the prey is not there, or maybe the river flow is too low, so they can't actually migrate upstream. Again, resulting in lots of mortality if that was to occur. And with climate change being so unpredictable, it's likely that this is occurring and resulting in lots of population mortalities, or individual mortalities at least. So we know there's 2 migratory life stages, and I spoke about the smolt migration timing, and they've advanced the migration timing over time as well. And the same is happening with returning adults. They'll also advance the migration timing. So both of these life stages have started migrating earlier, and that's concomitant to changes in the climate. And is there a genetic basis to this? So previous transplant experiments say yes. So they took one population of Atlantic salmon, like say further south, and they moved it to a different river with a later migration timing further north. But that southerly population retained their original migration timing. So that suggests there is a genetic basis to run timing. Oh. So what do we know about the genetic basis of run timing so far? So for smolts, we don't know anything for either European or North American populations. But for returning adults, for European populations, there's been 3 studies done so far on return timing of adults who found a single gene associated with return timing. And this gene is associated with eye development. So that could be really good, a visual cue for which river to go back to or when to migrate back to the river. We don't know really what it does, but it's linked to, in terms of migration timing, but we do know it's linked to eye development. But for North American populations, we don't know what the genetic basis of return timing is. So that's where our project SalMove comes into it. So the aim of SalMove is to understand how Atlantic salmon populations will be globally impacted by climate change through their migration timing. So their migration timing phenotype, and then also their genotype, so their genetic variation. So we established this amazing collaborative network across the distribution of Atlantic salmon, and asked the following questions. Well, we characterised the genetic base of run timing, and then we examined the vulnerability of those populations to climate change. And I'm just going to be focusing in on North America for the results of this presentation at least. So for Atlantic Canada, we had 2 populations in Labrador, 3 in Newfoundland and 2 in the Maritimes, so about 500 individuals altogether. And we used the day that the adult fish came back to the river as the run timing, the day of that, as their the run timing phenotype. And then we look at what the migration timing is like for each population. You can see the green is the 1C winter fish, or the grills. The red is the multi-sea winter fish, so those fish that spent multiple winters out at sea. And then you can also see, so on the x-axis is day of return, and the y is how many returned across the time period that this data was collected for. And then you've got green and purple dots underneath, and those are the individuals that we sampled for this 500 individuals. So you can see it's mainly one peak all the way through until we hit the Maritimes, where you get this bimodal run timing pattern. So there's multiple run timing peaks here, and that's only present in the Maritimes and not in the other populations. So then we took hole punches from their tail and sequence their DNA, and then this is what it looks like. So you've got your SNPs. So this is a CG and this is a TA. So this is this individual's genotype, or its genetic variation. And then we do another one, and this individual has a TA and a TA, and that is their genetic variation. So you can see that these 2 are different individuals because they have a different SNP in those locations, and these SNPs overlap genes. And this is basically what 23andMe is. So this is, I don't know, someone in Norway, and this is someone in Scotland, and that's how related they are, is from that. But the more people that do it, and you've got the whole genome, so it's a huge amount of genetic variation that you can look at. So that's what we do. We get the genetic variation, and then we correlate it with the adult day of return. And what we're expecting, like the European populations, is to see that 6/6 gene, the one associated with eye development, to be our major gene, and a lot of other genes associated with it as well, just because migration timing is a very complex trait and it's very diverse. But we expect to see 6/6. What we actually see is not 6/6, and not lots of genes, but just one major gene called PPFIA2, and very few other genes associated with return timing in North American salmon. But what's interesting is that this gene is also associated with migration timing in the purple martin as well. And like, why is this interesting? Why does it matter that it was found in birds? Well, birds and fish, if you imagine those evolutionary trees, they diverged millions of years ago, and they still have that one gene is still shared between them that's associated with that trait. And that trait with climate change is really important to understand how that gene is involved in influencing migration timing. And it could be really important as species have to change with climate change. The migration timing needs to change as well. And we can actually use how PPFI2 changes across the landscape to see what that pattern looks like. So here is just a base map of a climate change projection. And here are pie charts of the frequency of this gene in each of those populations I showed you earlier. So as we move further north, the blue, so that gene kind of decreases as we move northwards. So we can combine these climate projections to identify which populations are most at risk of climate change. So I don't know if I'm sure lots of you have probably seen these climate change scenarios. So here we've got sustainability. So this is assuming, this are climate change scenarios for the years 2080 to 2100. So these are just predictions. So we stay in like a very sustainable way of living, then this is the best case scenario. So this is like green energy, everything, sustainability is our priority. At the other end of the extreme, we have fossil fueled development. So everything is invested into fossil fuels, and this is what our climate will look like. And then this is where we're at now. So kind of middle of the road. So we're middle of the road at the moment. So best case scenario, worst case scenario. And the projection I'm going to show you is just assuming the worst case scenario, which hopefully will never happen. So then I'm going to show you a map with a measure of climate change vulnerability. So if it's blue, it means it's predicted to have low vulnerability to climate change based on the migration timing genes. If it's red, it's supposed to be predicted to be high vulnerability to climate change based on those run timing genes. And I've also increased the number of populations and that was used in this study. So when we look at it, we can see that the Maritimes have blue, so low vulnerability to climate change based on this projection for the year 2060, 2080, worst case scenario, and with the run timing genes that we selected. And then high vulnerability in Newfoundland, and then high, but not as high as Newfoundland in Labrador. And what's interesting is that these low vulnerability populations also are the populations with the highest diversity in run timing. So they have that 2 run timing peaks for all of those populations, whereas all the other populations just have a single run timing peak. So diversity is important. So I don't know if anyone's heard of the portfolio effect, but for those who haven't, you've probably put your savings into lots of businesses, like investing into lots of little businesses, because if you put all of your savings into one business and that business goes bankrupt, then you've just lost all of your savings. Whereas if you diversify your investments into multiple businesses, if a couple don't do very well or goes completely bust, then overall you've got an increase in your savings and you've just spread that risk. And it's exactly the same with genetic diversity and diversity in wildlife or anything in general. It's like the more diverse of a toolkit you have, that toolbox, the better equipped you are to cope with change, and you're spreading the risk. So you are ready for change when it happens. So I just want to take a look into the past and when did conservation of Atlantic salmon begin? And it actually began as early as 1285 in England, where they noted that the numbers of salmon were really low, and they actually established penalties for taking young salmon with nets or mill engines. And I just wanted to use an example here, just to show, back in the 18th century, what they knew was happening, what they did, and what happened. So this is based on a book. Well, it's not based on a book. This was described by Bolster in a book from 2012. And it was from the Merrimack River in the US. And he spoke about this miller, we'll just call him Miller, who looked at his river and noted that there's no salmon coming back anymore. Why is that? And when he looked at stream, he was like, oh, maybe it's my dams, or it wasn't dams in those days. Again, this is AI. It kind of over-egged the damming back in the 18th century. But he was a miller, so you can imagine he diverted a lot of the water into his mill rather than through the river, which made it difficult for the salmon to migrate upstream. So he was like, I know, I'll take away some of those dams further downstream and see if that helps the salmon to return. And so what he did, he blew it all up, and then the salmon started returning, but he didn't want to take down all the dams because that's his business. Anyway, so he was happily going along with his day, and then he saw a fisherman in his river fishing his fish. And obviously he wasn't happy because all the fish in his river is going down because of the fisherman. Anyway, the fisherman, a bit disgruntled, went on a walk on a beach and then saw a load of netters netting his fish. And he was like, hey, the fish are going downhill because of you. And this is basically a long-winded way to say it's so easy to point the finger at other people who might be fishing or might be damming or netting. And actually, it's not just one of those effects on its own. It's all those effects together, like I mentioned in the poll at the beginning on that Mentimeter app. Everything works in unison to kind of affect population abundance of Atlantic salmon. So this is just a quote from someone in the early 18th century that noticed that their fish were being harassed, catched and destroyed, and that they had great reason to fear that the river fishery will be wholly destroyed unless some proper methods are taken to prevent or remove those impediments. So they were actually aware of the unsustainable practices, but the attraction of fishing and the fact that they fish for their livelihoods meant that they were happy to just put their day of reckoning further in the future. And salmon are now gone from that river. So it is just really like a kind of a way to say that the future really is now. Like, we're seeing those declines, and salmon aren't coming back in the numbers that they were. And if we take lessons from the past, is that this is just a sign that we need to start doing something about it now, because we don't have time to put it further in the future, especially now that we've also got climate change on top of everything that was going on in the past as well. Fast forward to today, what's it looking like? So it's not very good to just do a screenshot. So I definitely recommend people, if you're interested, to go to NASCO and just have a look at this database that they have on the status of rivers across the distribution of Atlantic salmon. So you can see in the US, most of those populations are lost completely. There's an artificially sustained grey one here. And as we move further north, so in like southern Atlantic Canada, you can see there are a few high risk populations, low risk, lots of unknown, especially as we move north into northern Labrador. In Europe, especially in southern Europe, you can see the same, lots of unknown, some black, so like lost, artificially sustained, especially over here. And as we move further northwards, we get high risk and then moderate risk quite far up, and then some greens at the very north of the distribution of Atlantic salmon, but again, a lot of unknowns as well. And some of the recommendations from the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organisation, so NASCO, and what they're doing right now for the conservation of Atlantic salmon is that they're trying to promote strong, healthy and resilient wild populations. And a primary way to achieve this is to protect the genetic integrity of stocks. And that means also improving the habitat and water quality as well. Recognising that people are an important component of the conservation process, and also it's important to maintain complex life histories, so multiple sea ages, migration timing, and that helps to maximise their resilience. So I just want to focus in on this one. So recognising that people are an important component of the conservation process. So I really liked what they said here was managing salmon is managing people. So Indigenous people in Canada and Norway, they have all this traditional knowledge, and I'm sure it's the same people in the Scottish Islands as well. You've probably got this wealth of knowledge from your ancestors that just been passed down. And as scientists or researchers or biologists or whoever collects the data to understand patterns, sometimes the funding isn't there to collect that data, and sometimes you don't have time to collect that data, because conservation often is like an A&E department. You've just got to go, but sometimes we don't have the resources to protect before something's already gone. So that's when that traditional knowledge is really important. Salmon conservation is ultimately a human endeavour. And how can we improve this social dimension and the communication between all the different stakeholders like for the conservation of Atlantic salmon. So some things like improving trust and dialogue. That's why I'm so happy to give this presentation to you guys today. So we don't often give presentations to the public, and it's quite nice just to hear your thoughts about what you think, and also seeing how we can get our research out and what kind of information and insight that you guys have. And then also it's important that we repeat those interactions and collaborations, use the traditional knowledge, and also many concerns are often based on a lack of knowledge. So it's important to provide education as well. So that's when the final Mentimeter, you don't have to do this now though. I'll pop this up in the final slides. It'll be up for a while, and I'll leave it up for a few days in case people just want to mull it over. But if you have any ideas on how we can better include you in the conservation of Atlantic salmon, then I'd be really interested to hear, even if you just want to think about it for a couple of days. And we've got a very diverse audience and from very different walks of life in terms of, from what we saw on the wordscape that we did earlier. So I'll pop that one on the slide at the end, so we can, you can carry on if you want to have a look at that at a later date. So what can we do? So I don't know if anyone's heard of collective agency, and that's just when people share belief in their collective power to produce desired results. So I don't know if anyone's ever been to a beach clean, and you feel really good when you're doing it. You also get a barbecue at the end. That's really nice. But it's just when you're surrounded by people also doing the same thing, that kind of action not only drives belief, but it drives action from other people as well. And so it's really important that we share those kind of stories, that we do what we're doing to help the environment, so that other people see and are encouraged and want to do similar kind of actions as well. So as we start to wrap up, I just want to say how important hope is. So I mentioned Johan Rockström's climate change TED talk at the start, and just said at the end, he's a really inspiring speaker because he doesn't only just talk about doom and gloom, but he also ends with, there's still time. We do still have time to act with this climate change before we reach those tipping points that we're approaching. So, and it got me thinking about this book here, which is it's a good book. And if you're interested in conservation and what's happening, then it's good to read. But you often, and I felt the same when I was reading, I often felt quite sad. And this review by Julia Jones, who's a conservation scientist at Bangor University, she said the same. It kind of left the reader feeling helpless rather than energized. And she said, although I share the author's grief for the natural wonders that have been lost, I think that hope is a more powerful emotion, and that she wants anyone interested in the extinction crisis to know more about the success that successes that conservation is having, because before they vanish, there is still so much we can do. So I just wanted to kind of start finishing up with some conservation success stories. And this is just very limited and taken from this paper here, because it just shows you a lot of success stories that's happening with each of these kind of taxa. So this is a range of local success stories and also global success stories, like the humpback, the humpback whale. And these conservation success stories have happened thanks to hunting moratoria / legal protection, and also the establishment of marine protected areas. And if we look at benthic fauna and coral reefs, this has also improved as well in some areas. So reduced chemical pollution and restoration after over harvesting or human / physical disturbance. And a lot of this recovery was actually natural recovery as well, which suggests that the Earth's ecosystems are still able to naturally recover from various human-induced pressures that's happening. So that's also encouraging. And then we have the bony fishes and cartilaginous fishes. And so there's a lot of conservation success stories here. Just to note also, these are all based on ocean success stories. We can see red snapper off the coast of Australia. That's a conservation success story. And all of these happen thanks to the implementation of fishing quota, and again, moratoria, and the establishment of marine protected areas. So it'd be really nice if one day Atlantic salmon could be put on this map. And to do that, again, it's just about, I think, working together better. And this more amplified at the end of this paper that had those examples on there. but it's kind of underrepresented. So local communities and scientists, I was quite surprised at how little they contributed to those conservation successes. And when you think that local communities, well, everyone in fact, vote for government, and government has such a huge impact on all of these individual items that help conservation successes and failures. I wouldn't say help failures, but just if something fails, it's likely because of the governance rather than anything else. So we vote for those things to happen, and scientists communicate with local communities and vice versa. And local communities often get involved with NGOs. Scientists often advise about MPAs and fishing regulations. So I think it's quite an underrepresented map, but it's more highlighting the lack of communication between all of these groups and the fact that we don't communicate very well, and it seems to be largely determined by communication and strengthening that social dimension in conservation action. And that's what seems to be requiring the most effort, is just communication between all of these groups. So with that, this is the QR code that I mentioned. If you have any better ideas on how we can include you in the conservation of Atlantic salmon, and again, I'll leave that up for a while, but I'll leave it up for a few days, not the slide, but I'll leave the QR code access up for a few days. So if you have any ideas after just mulling it over, then there's still time to do it. And I just want to thank my team at DFO and UHI and the IBSC, and also my co-authors. And thank you guys for listening as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Your presentation was very interesting. I learned a lot from it. And
Thanks.
now I will stop the recording. Sorry, that will take me a moment. Stop.